The block went quiet the moment the new inmate walked through the steel doors, carrying nothing but a worn duffel bag and a face that betrayed no fear. Guards on either side of the entrance barely glanced at him, used to processing hundreds of men through that same corridor, yet something about the stillness in his eyes made even the most jaded among them pause for half a second longer than usual. Within 30 seconds, the most feared man in the entire facility crossed the yard, smiled with one corner of his mouth, and slapped him hard across the face just to entertain the crowd watching from the tables. Everyone expected the newcomer to drop to his knees or beg for mercy, the way every other man eventually did. What none of them knew was that the man standing there, absorbing the blow without blinking, had once been an undefeated boxing champion who had knocked out some of the most dangerous fighters on earth, and today he had nothing left to lose. The facility was a maximum security compound, built from gray concrete and bad intentions, the kind of place where silence was currency and weakness was a death sentence. Every hallway carried an unspoken law that new arrivals understood within hours of stepping inside. Nobody showed fear, nobody looked away too quickly, and every single new face was tested before the ink dried on their intake papers. It was simply how the place worked. A system older than any warden who had ever run it, enforced by men who had nothing to lose and everything to prove. Outside those walls, the world had already forgotten the man Marcus Johnson once was, and in many ways, he had worked hard to forget himself too, burying a former life beneath years of silence and discipline. The transport van that brought him to the facility had rattled along back roads for nearly 4 hours, and not once during that ride had he asked the guards a single question or shown any sign of nervousness about what waited at the end of the journey. He simply watched the landscape pass through the small reinforced window, his expression unreadable, his hands resting calmly on his knees the entire time. Whatever storm had once defined his younger years seemed to have settled permanently into something quieter, something almost monastic in its restraint. Marcus Johnson walked through that gate like a man already at peace with whatever waited for him. He was 38 years old, built like something carved rather than grown. His shoulders wide enough to fill a doorway and his forearms marked with old scars that told stories nobody bothered to ask about. His conviction was for manslaughter, a case the file described in clinical terms but which Marcus never spoke of to anyone. He had been sentenced for killing a man, the circumstances buried somewhere in paperwork nobody on the block cared to read. All they saw was a quiet, broad-shouldered stranger with eyes that gave away nothing. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue with the guards processing him. He didn't meet anyone's gaze for longer than a heartbeat, not out of fear, but because he had learned long ago that staring too long was an invitation, and Marcus Johnson was not interested in invitations. He moved through the intake line with the calm efficiency of someone who had done far harder things than walk into a prison, and that stillness, that complete absence of panic, was the first thing that caught the attention of the man who ran the yard. Rex Calloway had arrived at the facility nearly 7 years earlier, as just another anonymous transfer, and through sheer persistence and a willingness to hurt people that few others matched, he had clawed his way into a position no official title could ever capture, but every single inmate understood instinctively. He had built his reputation over 6 years of controlled violence, breaking men slowly enough that the guards rarely intervened and quickly enough that nobody forgot his name. He stood at the edge of the cafeteria that first afternoon, arms crossed, watching the new arrival take his tray without hesitation, without scanning the room for allies, without showing the slightest tremor of nerves. To Rex, that kind of calm wasn't peace. It was a target. He watched Marcus settle into a seat near the back wall, watched the way he ate without rushing, without flinching when the noise around him spiked. Rex had broken men twice Marcus's size, simply by standing too close and letting silence do the threatening for him. This new man didn't seem to register the threat at all, and that bothered Rex more than open defiance ever could. By the time the trays were half empty, Rex had already decided that this particular silence needed to be tested before the week was out. Word moved through the block faster than any official announcement ever could, the way it always did when a new face arrived with an unreadable past. Rex Calloway watched Marcus from across the cafeteria for 2 full days, studying the way he moved, the way he carried his tray, the way he never once raised his voice. By the third morning, watching had stopped being enough for a man who needed an audience to feel powerful. The cafeteria was packed when Rex finally made his move, the long tables filled with men eager for anything that broke the monotony of another gray afternoon. Rex crossed the room with the slow, theatrical swagger he always used when he wanted eyes on him, stopping directly behind Marcus's shoulder and leaning down close enough that his breath was the only warning. He asked a few questions meant to provoke, comments about where Marcus had come from, comments about whether he understood how things worked in a place like this. Marcus said nothing, his eyes fixed on his tray, his spoon moving in slow, deliberate circles through the food in front of him. The silence enraged Rex more than any insult could have. He leaned in closer, voice dropping into something meant to sound dangerous, and told the room he hated men who pretended to be tough without ever proving it. Then his hand moved fast, an open palm crashing across Marcus's face, with enough force to snap his head sideways and send the spoon clattering against the tray. The cafeteria erupted into laughter, dozens of men slapping the tables, shouting, treating the moment like the best entertainment the block had seen in weeks. Trays rattled against metal tabletops as men leaned forward to get a better view, some standing on benches to see over the crowd, the noise rising into something almost celebratory, as if violence here had become its own strange form of theater that everyone had been waiting all week to watch performed. Marcus turned his head back slowly, his jaw tight, but his expression otherwise unreadable. He did not stand. He did not retaliate. He bent down, picked up the fallen spoon, with the same unhurried calm he had shown all week, wiped it against his sleeve, and continued eating exactly as he had before the slap landed. The laughter around him grew louder, men nudging each other, certain they had just watched a coward fold under the slightest pressure. Most of the block decided right then that the new man was exactly what Rex always looked for. Someone soft underneath whatever muscle he carried, someone who talked tough through silence, but crumbled the instant real violence arrived. They moved on to other conversations within minutes, already losing interest in a story that seemed to have ended before it began. But across the room, an old correctional officer named Daniels lowered his coffee cup slightly and watched Marcus finish his meal without so much as a flicker of anger crossing his face, and something about that stillness unsettled him in a way 30 years on the job had never quite prepared him for. That night, long after the lights along the corridor dimmed to their lowest setting, Marcus lay on his bunk staring at the ceiling without sleeping, his mind drifting back to a version of himself that felt like it belonged to another person entirely. He thought briefly of arenas filled with thousands of voices chanting his name, of gloves raised high while cameras flashed from every direction, and then let the memory pass without dwelling on it. The way he had trained himself to do for years now, he closed his eyes eventually, his breathing slow and even, the slap still faintly stinging against his cheek, though his expression in the darkness carried no trace of anger at all. By the following morning, Marcus Johnson had become the only topic worth discussing on the entire block. His name passed from cell to cell faster than any contraband ever moved through those halls. 3 competing theories took shape almost simultaneously, each one fighting for dominance among the men who claimed to understand exactly what they had witnessed. Some insisted he was simply a coward who had folded the moment real pressure arrived, a soft man wearing a hard man's body. Others whispered that something was wrong with him mentally, that no sane person absorbed a blow like that without reacting unless something inside them was already broken. A smaller group, quieter than the rest, suggested he was simply waiting, watching, calculating something the others were too impatient to notice. An older inmate named Otis Green sat near the back of the laundry room that morning. His eyes narrowed as he studied Marcus folding sheets with mechanical precision a few stations away. Otis had spent more years inside than most men spent free, and somewhere in that long stretch of decades, he had developed a memory for faces that rarely failed him. He stared at Marcus for a long moment, turning something over in his mind, then muttered to the man beside him that he had seen that exact face somewhere before, though he couldn't yet place where or when. He kept glancing back throughout the morning shift, distracted from his own folding, certain the answer was sitting somewhere just out of reach in the back of his memory. the way a forgotten name sometimes hovers at the edge of recognition without ever quite arriving. The work detail moved to the yard later that afternoon, where heavy crates needed shifting from one side of the loading dock to the other, under the supervision of bored guards counting down the hours. Marcus lifted weight that took two other men working together to manage, doing it with an ease that drew sideways glances from everyone nearby. His reflexes caught a falling crate before it struck another inmate's foot, his hands snapping out faster than anyone expected from someone his size. He moved the way trained athletes moved, weight shifting smoothly from foot to foot, balance never once compromised even under heavy load. Other inmates on the same detail noticed it too, though none of them had the trained eye to understand exactly what they were seeing, only that something about the new man's body moved with an economy of motion that none of theirs ever quite achieved, no matter how many years they had spent doing the same physical labor. Sitting nearby on a maintenance bench, a heavy-set man named Walter Briggs watched the entire sequence unfold with growing disbelief written across his weathered face. Walter had spent decades around boxing gyms before his own conviction ended that career permanently, training fighters who went on to fill arenas across the country. Before everything fell apart, he had been considered one of the finest trainers on the entire circuit, a man whose corner advice during championship bouts had been quoted in newspapers and replayed on sports broadcasts for years. He had trained eyes for footwork that most people never developed in a lifetime, and what he saw in Marcus's movement sent a cold jolt through his chest that had nothing to do with the afternoon heat. Walter rose from the bench slowly, his mouth slightly open, his mind racing backward through years of memory, trying to match a face from television broadcasts and magazine covers to the man lifting crates a few yards away. He whispered something under his breath, an exclamation that sounded almost like a prayer, his hands trembling slightly as the realization settled deeper into his chest. He told himself it couldn't possibly be true, that the man he was thinking of had vanished from public life years earlier, that fate could not possibly have dropped that same man into this exact yard on this exact afternoon. Walter waited 2 full days before approaching Marcus, choosing a quiet moment in the recreation yard when the guards were distracted and the surrounding men were occupied with their own conversations. He walked up slowly, hands visible, voice low enough that only Marcus could hear him clearly over the ambient noise of the yard. He asked directly whether Marcus had ever competed, whether the name registered, whether there was any truth to the suspicion eating away at him since the loading dock incident. Marcus answered with a flat denial, his expression giving nothing away, his voice carrying the same measured calm he used for every other conversation since arriving. But Walter had spent too many years studying fighters to be fooled by words alone, and his eyes drifted instead to the things that mattered more than denial ever could. He studied the knuckles, thickened and flattened, in a pattern that only years of heavy bag work produced. He studied the shoulders, the particular set of muscle that came from throwing thousands of punches with proper rotation. He studied the way Marcus shifted his weight even while standing still, a habit boxers never fully shed no matter how many years passed since their last fight. Memory finally clicked into place for Walter, with the force of a door slamming shut, pulling forward details he hadn't thought about in years. He remembered a national champion who rose quickly through the ranks before claiming a world title, with a string of devastating knockouts that left commentators searching for new ways to describe his power. He remembered the abrupt silence that followed, a career-ending accident that pulled the fighter from headlines and into a quiet that no journalist ever managed to fully explain. Marcus's only response was a quiet statement that the man Walter remembered belonged to a different life entirely, one that no longer existed and didn't need resurrecting. He turned away before Walter could press further, leaving the older man standing alone with confirmation he hadn't quite received, but somehow already believed completely. Meanwhile, across the yard, Rex Calloway sat with 3 of his closest men, sketching out plans for a second encounter that would finish what the slap in the cafeteria had only started. Rex chose the exercise yard for his second move, a stretch of open concrete tucked behind the weight equipment where camera coverage thinned and guard rotations left brief windows of opportunity. He brought 3 men with him this time, broad-shouldered enforcers who had helped him maintain control of the block for years, through exactly this kind of coordinated pressure. They waited until the guards drifted toward the opposite end of the yard, then closed in around Marcus from 4 different directions at once, cutting off every obvious path of retreat. The sky above was overcast that afternoon, a thin gray light settling over the concrete, and for a brief moment, nobody moved at all, the four men forming a loose circle, while Marcus simply stood at its center, his weight settled evenly, his hands loose at his sides, as though he had expected exactly this from the very beginning. The first punch came from Rex himself, a heavy right hand aimed at Marcus's jaw with enough force behind it to have ended most confrontations on the spot. Marcus simply wasn't there when it landed, his head tilting just enough to let the fist pass harmlessly through empty air inches from his face. He didn't counter. He didn't retreat. He simply reset his stance and waited for the next attack with the same patient stillness he had shown since the moment he arrived. A second man swung from the side, aiming low for the ribs, and Marcus shifted his weight just enough to let the blow glance off without connecting cleanly. The man's knuckles barely brushed fabric before momentum carried him stumbling past, and he caught himself against the chain-link fence, breathing hard, confusion flickering across his face as he turned back to try again. A third punch followed from behind, and Marcus rotated his shoulder at exactly the right instant to slip it entirely. The attacker's fist sailing past close enough to brush fabric, but nothing more. Each failed strike seemed to feed Rex's fury rather than dampen it, his face reddening with every wasted swing, sweat already beading along his hairline despite barely landing a single solid hit. The pattern continued for what felt like an eternity to the men watching from a safe distance. 4 against 1, and yet somehow nobody managing to connect with any real consistency. Marcus moved like water, finding the path of least resistance, weaving and tilting and stepping at angles that always seemed to put him just beyond reach. One of Rex's men, already breathing hard from the effort of throwing punches that never landed, muttered under his breath to the others that this man hadn't even broken a sweat yet despite the chaos surrounding him. That observation rippled through the group, with an unsettling weight, each man slowing slightly as the realization sank in that something about this fight wasn't unfolding the way every previous beating on this yard had unfolded. Rex refused to acknowledge the shift, driving himself harder, throwing combinations faster, determined to land something, anything, before his reputation absorbed permanent damage in front of an audience that had started gathering near the fence line to watch. Frustration eventually pushed Rex past the point where fists alone satisfied him, his hands sliding toward the waistband of his prison uniform, where a crudely sharpened piece of metal had been hidden for exactly this kind of moment. The blade caught the afternoon light briefly as he pulled it free, and the men around him tensed, sensing that the rules of the confrontation had just shifted into territory none of them had expected to reach. Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly, the first visible change in his expression since the entire ordeal began, and something in his posture settled into a stillness that felt different from the patient calm he had shown moments earlier. He understood immediately that restraint had reached its limit, that absorbing blows and dodging attacks no longer served any purpose once a weapon entered the equation. The decision formed in less time than it took to draw a single breath, his body already shifting into a stance that hadn't been seen on this yard before, weight balanced perfectly between both feet, hands rising into a guard that belonged in a championship ring rather than a prison courtyard. What happened next occurred faster than most of the witnesses could fully process, a blur of motion compressed into roughly 3 seconds of devastating efficiency. The men gathered near the fence line later swore they had blinked and missed half of it, certain only of the sounds that followed, sharp cracks of impact against bone and the heavy collapse of bodies hitting concrete, one after another, in rapid succession. A sharp jab snapped forward first, catching the nearest attacker squarely between the eyes and dropping him instantly to the concrete. Before that man's body finished falling, a powerful cross connected with Rex's exposed jaw, the blade clattering from his hand as his knees buckled beneath him. A third man lunged forward, attempting to capitalize on the chaos, only to meet a perfectly timed uppercut that lifted him slightly off his feet before he collapsed in a heap beside his companions. The fourth attacker froze for half a heartbeat too long, that hesitation costing him as Marcus pivoted and delivered one final strike that ended the confrontation entirely. 4 men lay scattered across the concrete in various states of unconsciousness, and the entire sequence had unfolded so quickly that most witnesses struggled to describe exactly what they had seen when guards finally arrived to investigate the commotion. A security camera mounted above the weight equipment had captured the entire confrontation in crisp, undeniable detail, footage that would eventually circulate through the administration offices and reshape everyone's understanding of who Marcus Johnson actually was. Word of the fight spread through the facility faster than any official report could move through proper channels, distorted slightly with each retelling but never losing the core. Astonishing fact that one man had dropped 4 attackers in seconds without appearing to break stride. The footage reached the warden's office by early evening, and within an hour, 3 senior staff members had gathered around a monitor, replaying the confrontation frame by frame, trying to make sense of movement that seemed almost too precise to belong to an untrained inmate. The warden himself, a tired man named Frank Sullivan, who had run the facility for nearly a decade, watched the playback twice before saying anything at all, his arms folded tightly across his chest as the footage looped back to the beginning a second time. He finally asked the room whether anyone had bothered checking this inmate's history beyond the standard criminal record, a question that hung in the air for a moment before one of the officers reviewing the tape. A man who had spent years following combat sports before his career shifted toward corrections work, leaned forward suddenly, with recognition dawning across his face. He paused the footage on a single frame, capturing Marcus mid-strike, his form so technically flawless that it triggered a memory the officer hadn't accessed in years. He pulled up the facility's intake records, scrolling quickly until Marcus Johnson's file filled the screen, then cross-referenced the name against old sporting archives the prison system rarely had reason to access. The search returned results within minutes, and the room fell into stunned silence as a photograph appeared showing a younger version of the same face, gloved hands raised in victory beneath bright arena lights, a championship belt draped over one shoulder. Marcus Johnson, the records confirmed, had once held a world championship title in the sport of boxing, a career built on devastating power and footwork, so refined that opponents struggled simply to land clean shots against him. Sports analysts at the time had described him as nearly impossible to hit cleanly during his championship years. His defense so disciplined that entire fights would pass, with opponents barely grazing him, despite throwing hundreds of punches across a dozen rounds. His professional record showed an unbroken string of victories, the majority ending in decisive knockouts, with no documented instance of Marcus ever being knocked down himself throughout his entire competitive career. The information moved through the facility like wildfire, once it reached even a handful of inmates, transforming overnight from a man considered a coward into someone surrounded by an entirely new kind of reputation. Men who had laughed, loudest in the cafeteria that first week, now lowered their eyes whenever Marcus passed through common areas, their earlier mockery replaced by a wary respect. Nobody dared voice aloud. Stories about the 4-man beatdown grew more exaggerated with each retelling, spreading from block to block, until inmates in entirely separate wings of the facility claimed to know exactly what had happened, despite never witnessing it firsthand. The transformation in how people treated him happened almost instantly, yet Marcus himself showed no visible reaction to the shifting atmosphere, continuing his routine with the same quiet discipline he had maintained since his very first day. In blocks far removed from where the fight had actually taken place, men who had never laid eyes on Marcus Johnson began repeating his name with a strange mixture of awe and disbelief, certain details of the story shifting slightly with every retelling until the truth and the legend became almost impossible to separate. Some claimed he had taken on 6 men single-handedly rather than 4. Others insisted he had done it without throwing a single punch at all, relying instead on some mysterious technique nobody could quite explain. The exaggerations mattered less than the underlying truth they were all circling, a truth that settled over the entire facility like a change in weather, impossible to see directly, but felt by everyone regardless of which block they called home. Rex Calloway woke up in the medical wing with a swollen jaw and an injury to his pride that proved far harder to treat than the bruising across his face. He spent 2 days recovering under careful watch, his mind replaying the confrontation obsessively, searching for some explanation that didn't end with him losing control of the yard he had ruled for years. The medical staff treating his jaw noted that he barely spoke during checkups, a silence unusual for a man who normally filled every room with his voice. And one nurse mentioned to a colleague that something about his eyes during those 2 days looked less like anger and more like a man quietly reconsidering everything he thought he understood about strength. Humiliation curdled quickly into something colder and more dangerous, a determination to restore his reputation by any means necessary, regardless of what it cost him or anyone standing in his way. He began recruiting almost immediately upon release from medical observation, reaching out to contacts across multiple blocks who owed him favors accumulated over years of careful manipulation. Within days, he had assembled a group numbering well past 10 men, far larger than anything he had ever needed to assert dominance before this particular conflict began. He promised some of them favors, threatened others quietly, and reminded a few simply that loyalty to him had always been rewarded, while disloyalty had never ended well for anyone who tried it. The scale of the gathering alone signaled how seriously Rex now regarded the threat Marcus represented, a threat that had grown from simple defiance into something approaching an existential challenge to everything Rex believed about his own power. The laundry room became the chosen battleground, a cramped space filled with industrial machines and limited sightlines that made it nearly impossible for guards to monitor effectively. Rex positioned his men carefully among the equipment, blocking every exit before Marcus arrived for his scheduled shift. The trap sprung with the same patience Marcus himself had shown during their earlier encounters. When Marcus stepped through the doorway and immediately recognized the ambush waiting for him, he stopped walking and spoke calmly into the tense silence, stating plainly that he had no desire to hurt anyone and asking them to reconsider before things went further than anyone could take back. Nobody listened. The first attacker lunged forward without hesitation, and within seconds the room erupted into full chaos, more than 10 men converging simultaneously in a confrontation far larger and more dangerous than anything that had unfolded in the exercise yard days earlier. The machines around them rattled and hummed, steam rising from a nearby press, the air thick with the smell of detergent and sweat as bodies collided against metal carts and folding tables. Marcus moved through the crowd with the same trained efficiency he had always possessed, but something in his approach this time carried a deliberate restraint. Every strike measured precisely to disable rather than damage. He used pure technique rather than brute force, redirecting momentum, using attackers' own weight against them, dropping men with controlled precision instead of the devastating power he was fully capable of unleashing. He never struck anyone who had already fallen. He never pursued a man retreating from the fight. Each movement carried the discipline of someone who understood exactly how much force a situation required and refused to exceed that line, even while surrounded by overwhelming numbers. By the time the confrontation ended, every single attacker lay incapacitated across the laundry room floor, and Marcus stood alone among them, breathing only slightly harder than before the fight began. Officer Daniels arrived just as the last man hit the ground, and unlike the chaos of the previous incident, this time he chose not to immediately call for backup or begin the standard disciplinary process. He stood quietly in the doorway for a long moment, studying Marcus and the scattered bodies around him, with an expression that mixed professional caution with something closer to genuine curiosity. After the room had been cleared and order restored, Daniels approached Marcus privately, away from other staff and inmates, and asked the question that had been building in his mind since that very first slap in the cafeteria. He wanted to know why Marcus consistently chose restraint, why a man with his obvious capability kept absorbing humiliation rather than ending every confrontation the moment it began. Marcus considered the question for a long moment before answering, his usual guardedness softening slightly in the presence of someone who seemed to be asking out of genuine concern rather than procedural obligation. He glanced briefly toward the small barred window near the ceiling, before speaking again, as though searching for the right words somewhere in the gray light filtering through it. He explained that during his competitive career, he had once thrown a punch in the ring that caused permanent damage to an opponent, an injury severe enough to end that man's ability to fight again and alter the entire trajectory of his life. The memory of that moment had never left him, weighing on his conscience long after the crowds stopped cheering and the championship belts stopped mattering. From that day forward, Marcus had made himself a quiet promise that he would only use his abilities as an absolute last resort, when every other option had been exhausted and no peaceful path remained available. He told Daniels that the conviction bringing him to this facility stemmed from a similar principle, that he had intervened during a violent altercation to protect someone who would have otherwise been killed, and the resulting confrontation left him facing manslaughter charges, despite his intentions never including murder. He admitted he had never wanted to be seen as some kind of hero or legend, that all he had ever wanted, both before and after his boxing career ended, was simply to live a quiet life, without causing harm to anyone around him. Daniels listened without interrupting, processing the weight of what he had just heard, and something in his understanding of Marcus shifted permanently in that conversation. He asked one final question before walking away, wanting to know whether Marcus ever regretted the choices that had brought him from championship arenas to a prison yard. And Marcus considered it carefully, before answering that regret was a luxury he had decided long ago he could not afford, that the only thing left to control now was how he carried himself through whatever remained of his sentence. Daniels nodded slowly at that, said nothing further, and walked back toward his post with a quiet respect he rarely extended to anyone inside those walls. Word of this explanation eventually filtered through the block in fragments, never confirmed officially, but somehow believed completely by men who had spent enough years inside to recognize genuine truth when they heard it secondhand. The respect that had begun forming after the fights in the yard and laundry room deepened into something closer to reverence. Inmates who had once dismissed Marcus as weak now, speaking of him with a quiet admiration that few men in that facility ever earned. Rex Calloway spent several days in isolation following the laundry room confrontation, his body recovering from the injuries he had sustained, while his mind wrestled with consequences far more difficult to process than physical pain. He had built his entire identity around control of that yard, around the fear other men carried whenever his name came up in conversation, and that foundation had crumbled completely in the span of 2 separate confrontations against a single opponent who had never once sought out the fight. The silence of isolation gave him too much time to think, and somewhere in that solitude, the anger that had driven him for years began curdling into something closer to genuine reflection. When Rex finally returned to general population, he requested a private meeting with Marcus through one of the few inmates both men still trusted, a request that surprised everyone who heard about it, given the history between them. The meeting took place in a quiet corner of the recreation yard, away from the usual crowds, with no audience gathered to witness whatever happened next. Rex approached without his usual swagger, his posture different, smaller somehow, the confidence that had defined him for years, noticeably absent from his bearing. He spoke first, his voice lacking the theatrical edge it always carried during confrontations, offering something that sounded almost unfamiliar coming from him, an apology delivered without excuses or attempts to minimize what he had done. He told Marcus that he had spent every night since the laundry room incident replaying the fight in his mind, trying to understand how a man with that much power had still chosen, every single time, not to use it against him when he easily could have. He acknowledged that he had underestimated Marcus from the very beginning, that his need to maintain control through fear had blinded him to the kind of man actually standing in front of him, and that he understood now how close his own arrogance had come to costing him and his men far worse outcomes than bruises and broken pride. Marcus listened to the entire apology without interrupting, his expression calm but attentive, weighing the sincerity of words against everything he had observed about Rex over the preceding weeks. When Rex finished speaking, Marcus accepted the apology with a simple nod, choosing not to extend a handshake or offer any further gesture beyond that quiet acknowledgement. It was enough. Something in that small exchange settled the conflict permanently, more effectively than any further violence ever could have, and both men understood without needing to say so that the matter between them had finally reached its conclusion. News of the private meeting spread through the block within hours, and the atmosphere across the entire facility shifted noticeably in the days that followed. The casual cruelty that had defined how new arrivals were treated began softening, Men who once eagerly tested every newcomer now hesitating, before repeating patterns that had governed the yard for years. Nobody dared openly challenge the change, but everyone seemed to understand that something fundamental had been altered by what Marcus Johnson had demonstrated, not through aggression, but through the controlled restraint he showed even while possessing every advantage imaginable. Marcus became something the facility had rarely produced before, a figure whose authority came not from violence itself, but from the discipline governing when violence became necessary at all. Younger inmates began watching him quietly, studying the way he carried himself, the way he handled conflict without ever needing to raise his voice or prove anything to anyone. One young man in particular, barely past his 19th birthday, and terrified through most of his first month inside, started sitting a few tables away from Marcus during meals, never speaking, just observing the calm way he ate, the calm way he nodded to passing guards, the calm way. Nothing around him seemed to disturb the steadiness he carried like a second skin. He never approached directly, but something about simply watching Marcus made the weight of his own sentence feel slightly more bearable, as though survival inside these walls might not require becoming someone he didn't recognize. He never sought followers or tried to build influence the way Rex once had, yet influence found him anyway, settling around him, the way respect always settles around people who clearly don't need it to feel secure in who they are. Weeks passed, and the facility slowly returned to a quieter rhythm, though something beneath the surface had permanently changed. One morning, a new inmate walked through the same gate Marcus had entered months earlier, carrying the same kind of worn bag and the same uncertain posture every new arrival brought with them into this place. A small group of men began drifting toward him with familiar intentions, the same predatory instinct that had once driven Rex to test every newcomer who crossed that threshold. Rex Calloway stepped forward before they reached the new man, placing himself directly in their path with a calm authority nobody expected to see from him again. The men around him exchanged confused glances, unsure whether to laugh or simply obey, the old version of Rex never once standing between them and easy entertainment at someone else's expense. He told them plainly that if they wanted to keep their lives simple and their days uneventful, they should remember never to judge a man based solely on his choice to stay silent. The group hesitated, exchanged uncertain glances, then dispersed without further comment, the lesson settling into the yard's collective memory, the way only hard-earned truths ever truly do. Far across the compound, away from the noise and tension that defined most mornings inside those walls, Marcus stood alone in a quiet corner of the exercise yard just before sunrise. He threw slow, deliberate punches into the empty air, his form perfect despite years removed from any official ring, his breathing steady and unhurried beneath the pale light just beginning to break over the horizon. He wasn't training for any fight. He wasn't preparing for any confrontation. He was simply maintaining the discipline that had carried him through every difficult chapter of his life, a private ritual belonging only to him. The true measure of strength, as Marcus Johnson's quiet presence within those walls came to demonstrate again and again, was never found in a man's ability to defeat everyone standing in front of him. It was found instead in his ability to master himself completely, to hold immense power in check through patience and discipline, and to act only when every other path had closed, and justice demanded nothing less than his full and final response. Years from now, long after his sentence had run its course, and the gates finally opened to release him back into a world that had moved on without him, the men who served time alongside Marcus Johnson would still remember the morning a slap echoed through a crowded cafeteria, and the silence that followed it taught an entire prison more about real strength than any fight ever could.